There was a time when action heroes didn't wear capes. They didn't come from distant planets or multiverses. They bled, they bruised, and they broke bones. Yet they stood back up, stronger, rougher, realer. From the 1980s through the early 2000s, Hollywood gave us a generation of men who embodied strength, courage, and flawed humanity all at once. They weren't just movie stars, they were ideals. Sylvester Stallone, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Bruce Willis, and Mel Gibson didn't just act in action films. They defined what it meant to be an action hero. But behind the sweat, the muscles, and the explosions was a story of rivalry, reinvention, and redemption. One that changed Hollywood forever. The rise of the real action hero. The late 1970s and early 1980s were a turning point. Audiences were tired of polished leading men and perfect heroes. They wanted grit. They wanted fighters who looked like they'd lived a life before the cameras started rolling. Enter Sylvester Stallone, a struggling actor with only $100 in his pocket and a script called Rocky in his hand. When every studio offered to buy his story but refused to cast him, Stallone held his ground. He sold his dog to survive, but never sold the dream. When Rocky finally hit theaters in 1976, it wasn't just a movie, it was a symbol. The underdog story wasn't fiction. It was Stallone's own life, and it changed everything. Within years, Hollywood had found its formula: sweat, sacrifice, and sheer willpower. Stallone's Rambo series became a global phenomenon, redefining the lone warrior archetype. Then came Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Austrian bodybuilder with impossible muscles and an even bigger ambition. After conquering bodybuilding, he set his sights on cinema. Conan the Barbarian and the Terminator made him larger than life, a mechanical god of strength and precision. The era of superhumans had arrived, but they still felt real. The 1980s, Brotherhood and Competition. By the mid-1980s, action cinema was a battlefield, and these men were its generals. Stallone's Rambo, Schwarzenegger's Commando, and Bruce Willis's Die Hard became cultural touchstones. Willis, unlike the muscle-bound heroes, represented the everyman, the cop who didn't need a perfect body to survive. His John McClane was flawed, sarcastic, and deeply human. The blood on his feet in Die Hard wasn't metaphorical. It was the pain of an ordinary man doing something extraordinary. Meanwhile, Mel Gibson exploded onto the global stage with Mad Max and Lethal Weapon, blending sensitivity with savagery. These weren't men who saved the world because they were chosen. They did it because no one else would. And behind the scenes, competition turned to camaraderie. The action genre wasn't about one man dominating. It was about proving who could push it further. Every explosion, every punch, every car chase was a silent contest of who could make audiences' hearts pound the loudest. The Price of Immortality. But fame, as it always does, came with a cost. Stallone, once the face of the underdog, became trapped by his own success. Audiences wanted Rocky and Rambo, not Stallone the artist. Schwarzenegger turned from cinema to politics, carrying his iron will into real life as the governor of California. Bruce Willis became an icon of sarcasm and grit, but behind the smirk, his personal life suffered from burnout, overwork, and, eventually, health struggles that silenced his voice. Mel Gibson, once the most bankable actor in Hollywood, fell into controversy that nearly erased him from the industry. Their journeys mirrored their films: triumph, fall, and the long road to redemption. Hollywood was quick to build them up, and just as quick to tear them down. The same tabloids that once celebrated their muscles now magnified their mistakes. But what made these men unforgettable wasn't perfection. It was how they fought their way back. Scandals, feuds, and redemption. Behind the cameras, the so-called action hero era was full of rivalry. Stallone and Schwarzenegger famously feuded during the 1980s, competing for box office supremacy. They mocked each other publicly, each trying to outdo the other in absurdity. Bigger guns, louder explosions, and higher body counts. But years later, they laughed about it, even co-starring in The Expendables and Escape Plan, two films that celebrated their shared legacy. Bruce Willis had his own battles, not just with studios, but with himself. As the 2000s rolled in, his career slowed. The man who once cracked jokes while walking barefoot on glass struggled to find relevance in a world shifting toward superheroes and CGI. Then came the heartbreaking revelation of his health diagnosis, frontotemporal dementia, which ended his career but opened a flood of love and respect from the industry he helped shape. Mel Gibson's downfall was the hardest to watch. After a series of public incidents and damaging recordings, Hollywood turned its back on him. For years, Gibson was a pariah, but redemption came quietly. Films like Hacksaw Ridge reminded audiences of the artist behind the mistakes, the visionary who could tell human stories of courage and morality. And through all the chaos, one truth remained. These men lived their characters. Their off-screen lives were as turbulent, flawed, and courageous as the heroes they portrayed. The fall of the genre. By the early 2000s, the landscape changed. The practical stunts, real explosions, and sweat-drenched realism of the 1980s were replaced by green screens and digital doubles. The heroes who once looked like men you might meet in real life were replaced by comic book gods. Franchises like The Avengers and Fast and Furious dominated, but something was missing. The vulnerability, the authenticity, the human struggle. The action hero had become superhuman, and in the process, he lost something essential: relatability. Where Stallone's Rocky fought his own doubts, modern heroes fight CGI monsters. The risk feels smaller because the pain feels less real. Hollywood's obsession with youth and perfection left little room for the kind of heroes who aged, failed, and learned. The nostalgia that won't die, and yet audiences never truly let go. When Creed revived the Rocky legacy, it wasn't just nostalgia. It was a reminder that characters still mattered. Stallone's older, humbler version of Rocky became one of his most beloved performances. Schwarzenegger returned for Terminator. Dark fate, embracing his age with dignity. Bruce Willis continued making films even when his dialogue was limited, simply because audiences wanted to see that smirk one more time. Mel Gibson returned behind the camera, earning respect not through fame, but through craftsmanship. These returns weren't desperate comebacks. They were emotional homecomings. Every wrinkle, every scar, every weathered expression reminded audiences why these men mattered. They weren't superheroes. They were us. Older, imperfect, but still standing. The legacy of masculinity and humanity. What these action heroes represented went beyond biceps and bullets. They shaped how an entire generation viewed courage, failure, and strength. For many young men in the 80s and 90s, Stallone's perseverance, Arnold's discipline, Willis's grit, and Gibson's emotion became lessons in manhood. They taught that real strength isn't just about domination, it's about resilience. In an era where masculinity is constantly redefined, these men serve as complex symbols. They were strong but emotional, powerful yet broken. They cried, they failed, they loved, and they still fought back. Their films didn't tell you to be perfect. They told you to keep going. That's why decades later, their stories still echo. Today, the torch has been passed to a new generation. Dwayne Johnson, Jason Statham, Keanu Reeves, and Tom Cruise. They carry pieces of that old-school DNA, but in a new world. Cruise, in particular, has become the bridge between eras, performing his own stunts in Mission Impossible, risking his life the way action heroes once did. But even he admits the landscape is different. Social media, algorithms, and global markets have reshaped stardom. Still, the spirit of those 1980s icons lives on. Every slow-motion walk from an explosion, every one-liner delivered after a knockout punch, it all traces back to Stallone, Schwarzenegger, Willis, and Gibson. They built the blueprint. Everyone else followed. The men who defined a generation of action didn't just make movies. They made mythology. They showed us that pain could be power, that mistakes could lead to redemption, and that even when the lights fade, legacy doesn't. Today, Hollywood is faster, flashier, and louder, but it rarely feels real. Maybe that's why we keep going back to the old films, replaying Die Hard every Christmas, rewatching Rambo on late-night TV, or quoting Terminator lines decades later. These stories endure because they remind us of something we've lost, the belief that greatness doesn't come from perfection, but from persistence. As the world scrolls past new stars every day, these men remain eternal. Their muscles may have aged, their faces may have changed, but their message hasn't. You fall, you fight, you rise again, because that's what true action heroes do.